Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. On this new episode, we'll be starting our look at the civilizations with a heavier focus on their art than on their history and their politics, as we've already done. Today, we're going to be having our first look at the ancient era art leading up to the Bronze Age, and the main example that we're going to be looking at will be ancient Egypt. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. What were the ancient forms of art, and how did ancient people communicate the art that they had at their time? There were about three main categories that I think it can be broken down into pretty generally, and so we're going to take a look at those first and how they communicated their perspective at this point in time. The first would be painting, or visual storytelling. These included interpretable images such as birds and people and scenes, and it was separate from writing. So we think a lot of the idea of painting and of photography as capturing an exact image or a moment in time, but for a lot of human history there wasn't a whole lot of record to go off of. There weren't a lot of people reading and writing, and the main focus of the visual arts was actually on storytelling, conveying messages, reminding people of their woes and of their conquests and of all the history and various other topics that they might need to come across in a daily basis. So painting was much more important than we might think of it as today. It was a connection with the past, and it was one of the main ways of remembering for most people who were alive. The next major form would be construction, and this deserves a little bit of an explanation as well. When I say construction, I mostly mean architecture and sculpture. Both of these two artistic activities relied heavily on the ability of stone cutting and moving stones, and being able to fashion materials that were found in the wild into something a little bit more civilized. This manipulation of materials would become very important in future societies for building temples and houses and roads and all kinds of things. It was more monumental and simple at this time for various reasons that we will get into, but construction would be the manipulation of physical materials into an art form or an inhabitants. The final and third group of art from the ancient era that I want to discuss is poetry. And by poetry, I mean communicated storytelling. Today we think of poets as people who write in specific formats, using stanzas and that kind of thing, but the ancient Greek word for poet meant creator. A poet would have been a playwright as well as a religious storyteller. Just about anyone that was up and communicating effectively without using visual representations would have been considered poets. They didn't have a lot of the concepts that we have now of the earth and history and a lot of ideas that sort of solidify our worldview. So when they said that these people were creators, they meant it quite literally. These people were creating the world that most others lived in. And so poetry, communicated storytelling, it mostly would have been oral or read aloud, recited aloud, through most of history up until writing sort of started to blossom in the Iron Age and beyond. But originally it would have been much like this. It would have been one person talking to another or to a group, and the idea of written storytelling and written poetry actually came later, but I think they both have a lot of the same idea and concept mixed in. So now I want to discuss a little bit about the origins of art. Art actually has a very long-standing history, one of the oldest masterpieces being the cave paintings in Lascaux in France, which brings up a curious point. These were done in oil, and as far as we know, oil painting, if left preserved, basically lasts forever. As long as people don't go into these caves, touch them with their hands and rub at them and do that sort of thing, and they stay in there in preservation, these art pieces will continue on. And this is a really important part of ancient visual art that might sort of be lost on us today in an age where millions of photos are being taken every year. It seems more disposable now. Seeing a great work of art, especially back in the ancient age, would have been monumental, and it's something that someone would have paid a lot of money and a lot of time into to preserve a story moving forward. So you can look at these paintings and you can sort of write them off as being simplistic or too minimalist or something like that, but these were the first captured perspectives, and they meant a lot, and they meant enough to be preserved in one of the artistic mediums that would last the longest. This was one of the main points, especially with ancient Egypt and a few other civilizations in West Asia, that they had their constructions and their temples, but these were to house the paintings and the visual art. These visual art pieces would have been done during a time when something important that needed to be remembered happened, and then they would be preserved, and the storytellers would come in and they would work off of the visual art to bring the story that had been around for centuries. Another really important origin for art in this ancient time was the need for stone cutting. Large houses, temples, important buildings that would need to last for a while and be seen were built out of stone. And the thing about stone is it's very hard, it's difficult to move, and especially with bronze tools, you would have to get very creative to cut and wield these into usable materials for construction. Stone cutting became a very large part of the ancient era, mostly because if you had stone cutters who could effectively build, you had civilization, and others who didn't simply didn't. Stone cutting was very eminent. A lot of higher order people would have been stonemasons and construction builders. And another important part in this is that if you were a good stone cutter, you could make a lot of money and do very well for yourself. Beyond that, if you were a good stone cutter, you could try and do sculpting. Sculpting is very interesting. We'll definitely see with two-dimensional art that they had a lot of struggles with perspective and other ideas in representing realism, but you don't run into this when you're cutting stone because it's a 3D object that you're manipulating to look like a 3D object, rather than in painting, where you have a 2D object that you're trying to manipulate to look like a 3D object. This allowed for much better preservation of real features, and they would build statues to remind people of certain figures, pharaohs and past descendants of his, to really capture that feeling of being in the moment, which their visual art really couldn't give at the time. Even when writing did exist, most people weren't capable of using it. When ancient Egypt had their original scribes, about 5 to 10% of the population would have fallen into there, and the rest of them had basically no need for the language. It was so complex and convoluted that it would have been very difficult to effectively communicate it or to use it in an everyday life where that's not the one thing that you do. But all of these people in Egypt still needed to know the stories of their time and their tales, their legends, their history, the biographies of their great people, but they didn't have the access of reading. So this is where oral communication and visual storytelling became very important. People might only ever hear of history and educational topics through spoken word at this time, and it would have been a major playing point in these societies. In this series, I really want to look at the continuation of the refinement of art through time, and one of the ways we're going to do this is by looking at the limitations and the complications of the different art from the different periods. So, there were a lot of complications in the ancient times that led to very unrealistic looking art and very narrow avenues for creating new art. Perspective was one of the most difficult challenges of the time, which you can most readily see in their visual art. They show these very composite images, especially in their paintings, where the feet and the lower body appear to be from a side view, and the head appears to be from a side view, the body appears to be a frontal view, the feet are again at the side. They don't have a very good way of showing differences in height, or if one person's closer or further away. They're all aimed at the audience, meaning that it's not a capture of an image, it's more a telling of a story, the way that a play is done. You never see an actor's back. In ancient painting and visual representations, you never see a character's back. There was a huge problem when you're going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. If you don't believe me and you're an untrained artist, try to draw a road disappearing off into the distance, or a building that's wall is receding past your perspective. Unless you know how to do these things and how to approach these concepts because you were taught by someone else, they're very difficult, and especially the concept of buildings disappearing towards a horizon or atmospheric perspective, where things have a sort of different color because of the amount of air between you and them, such as mountains in the distance. A lot of these small details were either removed entirely to leave sort of a blank background, or were crudely added in just to kind of give a setting. A lot of the concepts of mathematics that would later be necessary for construction and engineering didn't really exist in a formal way at this time. A lot of the construction that you see is very simple. Ziggurats, which were essentially just stone pyramids. The triangle and inherently the pyramid are very, very strong structures. A triangle equally distributes weight down both of its legs. It is much simpler to build. I think only the column is technically stronger than triangle construction. So we see a lot of this in early construction because this is the sort of thing that they had access to. They knew if they had a wider base than top that they could build it and gradually just slope it off. So that's the kind of thing that you see done a lot. The other thing that's sort of added in with that is the use of bronze tools. These guys were using sand and rope and wood to carve stone. They had bronze chisels, but these weren't really hard enough, especially when compared with later iron tools, to the point where they must have had a lot of dedication. A lot of these monuments that you see are actually very beautiful and represent a lot more than I think most of us understand. They took a lot of effort and a lot of imagination and a lot of technical skill, but unfortunately they didn't do as well as future generations would because they didn't have the access to the mathematics. And one of the main problems with their storytelling should be sort of obvious. There's no way to verify that a tradition which has been told orally for centuries has stayed true to the original intent in any way. Even if you have a visual aid, such as a painting that the priests are going off of, there's no way to know that they haven't skewed it in their favor or in the interest of someone who's on their side. There's no way to know that the story hasn't been told so many times that just little things have changed. It's not an effective way of storing information. which is why a lot of these older stories end up coming off more as legends and fables than as actual history or knowledge, because it would have been easier to preserve and to present information that was inherently a story, and any flaws that surfaced could have been from the schema that was used rather than in the actual telling of the story. So there was a lot of different complications that art suffered at this period. We'll take a little bit closer look at these and we'll explain what it is exactly that I'm talking about. So, our example for this period is ancient Egypt. We're going to be taking a close look at the three categories that I've outlined for them. And first off, we'll be looking at ancient Egyptian painting. There's not going to be a thought experiment this episode. I wanted to do it on a famous ancient era painter, but I couldn't really find one. I thought about doing something on Akhenaten. We're going to talk about him in a bit, but it just really wasn't accessible. And I mentioned in a previous video that historically signing your own work didn't exist until much later. At this time, painters and visual artists would have been more relegated to telling the stories and representing the images that the priest class and the oral storytellers wanted as a background for their communications. They didn't have as much sway in society. They would have been definitely subject to the priest classes who were in charge of communicating the information, the history, those sorts of stories to the people. And because of that, we're a little limited in scope and what we can look at, but what we do have is very important and very unique and shows a great glimpse of the lengths that art has gone through in the several thousand years that we've had established cultures. So when we look at these, I want to point out a couple of things. Most of these paintings that we have left are not individual artists contributing their work or attempting to push the boundaries or anything like that. Most of the visual work that we have left is images that were created for stories that were being told. So they were all visual communication tools, essentially. They were housed in a lot of temples that we have still today, in some of the pyramids and in some areas like that. They were there for a purpose, to be the backdrop of a story that was being told. Hieroglyphs went through some different evolutions to become a more formalized language and to keep Egypt competitive with other societies which had much more efficient communicating devices. But originally, they were individual symbols, and these symbols were associated with different ideas. The concept of lining these symbols up and communicating a message at the beginning would have been much more abstract and would have been a lot more like interpreting a painting than interpreting a letter. When the pharaoh died, he went to the underworld to be judged and to attempt to recreate the glory of Horus and have the earth rotate again the next day for his people. This included a lot of people into their religion and made them an integral part, so they needed to keep up on what their end of it was, what the afterworld looked like, and why the pharaoh was important to them. This was the message that was mostly being communicated through their visual art, and a lot of it is sort of off. I'm going to throw up a few more pictures of ancient Egyptian paintings here, and we'll take a look at them. Notice the eyes. The eyes are a very distinct style, to be sure, but none of this really says realism about it. Their heads don't match up with their bodies. Their feet are disproportionate. In some pictures, important figures like the pharaoh are much, much, much larger than other people in the painting. Is that because the pharaoh is closer to the subject and the others are further away? Or is that supposed to connote some sort of importance to the pharaoh? Was it political propaganda? There's lots of different ways to look at it. It's important to remember that at this time, They didn't really understand what they were doing, they didn't really understand how to communicate different ideas, and they were making the best work that they could out of it. But at the same time, it's important when you look at something like this to be able to understand where we came from to be able to get to the point where we could visually represent people. It took a long time, and the ancient Egyptians tried, but as you can see from a lot of these paintings, they didn't really do the best job.